Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Marketing Live for Thursday, December 13th, 2018. I'm your host, Rob Zinkin. I serve as Associate Vice President for Marketing at Indiana University. And today I'm on our IUPUI campus in beautiful downtown Indianapolis. And I'm very excited about today's topic on giving and getting feedback about creative work. Dive into that and introduce today's guests. A reminder that Marketing Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education and beyond. You can be a part of our live broadcast today. Just use the Higher Ed Live hashtag on Twitter, join the discussion, and put out there any questions that you may have along the way. All of our episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast wherever you get your podcast. And if you happen to miss the last episode of Marketing Live on the amazing story of Sweetbriar College and its brand transformation, be sure to check out the podcast. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. So today I am delighted to have Todd Henry join us. He is a podcast host himself. I enjoy his podcast, The Accidental Creative, and Todd really does it all. He's an author, a speaker, consultant, and as mentioned, podcast host. His books include The Accidental Creative, Die Empty, Louder Than Words, and Herding Tigers. And we'll touch on some of the concepts from his most recent book, Herding Tigers, Be the Leader That Creative People Need. Todd, welcome. It's great to connect with you.
Rob, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I'd love to begin by learning a little bit more about your professional journey, Todd, and ask if there is something along the way that has had an impact on you and perhaps shaped some of your thinking on the areas that you speak about and write about, those being creativity, productivity, and passion for work.
Sure. Yeah. So I studied marketing in school, as we discussed before we started recording. Went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and studied marketing. And like any good marketing major, I did my tour of duty in the music business right out of school. And I, after that, ended up becoming creative director for an organization that was growing pretty quickly, but had a really small, thin staff. And so for a number of years, I spent my time leading designers and writers and people who had to really crank out a lot of work in a short amount of time. And I felt very ill-equipped to be able to deal with that. And so I started going to school on what is it that highly productive creative professionals do in order to continue to produce over time, and started experimenting with our team and teaching rhythms and practices and things like that. And I realized that there really wasn't a lot of conversation happening about that in the marketplace. This was 2002, 2003. So, back in the ancient days. And so I, right around 2005, this new thing called podcasting was starting to emerge. And so I started a podcast called The Accidental Creative in 2005 to share some of what we were learning about what was working well and what wasn't working well. And just to start a conversation about how to be, by that point, what I had dubbed prolific, brilliant, and healthy all at the same time. It's easy to be prolific and brilliant, but to burn out over and over again, that's not what we're going for. So started the podcast, and it pretty quickly took off. It was surprising, actually. Gained thousands and thousands of listeners right out of the gate, and then there were a couple of articles written, and then suddenly I was approached by a literary agent and a publisher about writing a book. And so I realized I think there might be a business here, trying to help people figure this out. And so 2009, I launched my business called Accidental Creative, officially launched my business called Accidental Creative. And really for the last, I guess, almost 10 years now, I've been traveling all over, working with companies, large, Fortune 20 companies, as well as, smaller entrepreneurial companies, helping them figure out how to collaborate more effectively, how to be prolific, brilliant, and healthy, and how to really tap into their productive passion and do their best work. So that's kind of the long and the short of it. So I've written 4 books, as you mentioned. The Accidental Creative was my first book, Die Empty, which came out in 2013. Louder Than Words, which is about how to develop your voice as a leader and as a creative. And then Herding Tigers, which is about how to create an environment in which creative teams can thrive. So those are the 4 books I've written, all with Portfolio Penguin. And I guess that catches you up to date on where I am right now.
It does indeed. Excellent. And I hope today that we will help some of our listeners on the path to becoming more prolific, brilliant, and healthy. So I love that trifecta. And I thought, you mentioned your books, and I thought it might be a great way to start to read a section from Herding Tigers, because I think it will resonate for many in higher ed marketing who have creative teams, and will provide a useful backdrop for today's discussion. And that is on subjectivity. So I'll just read this briefly. Oh, and by the way, your final product will likely be judged by someone who gives you either a thumbs up or thumbs down, often based on little more than personal opinion or that of a committee of stakeholders. Even when based on research and sound reasoning, creative work is frequently qualitative in nature, so it can feel like you are shooting at moving targets while simultaneously switching weapons. On top of this, you have to manage the shifting expectations of your manager, the client, and team while steering them toward a resolution that will satisfy everyone. No pressure. So, wow, there's a lot to unpack there, and I appreciate the simplicity that you bring to this discussion in a way that is very applicable. And so again, I think many can relate, especially to the committee approach that was referenced in there. So could you break down these 3 simple, straightforward principles for how to give creative feedback about creative work, and walk us through those?
Yeah, because the nature of creative work is subjective. It's highly subjective, highly qualitative. If you do bad accounting, typically it's pretty easy to discover that you made a mistake and to correct it, right? So, well, this is wrong. Okay. Typically with creative work, marketing work, any kind of qualitative work that we're doing, it's not really a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of right or writer. I know there's a higher ed podcast, so I know that's not right. That's not a word, but it's really a matter of subjective opinion often as to what really fits the objectives. And so when you are trying to give feedback about work that maybe somebody has put their blood, their sweat, their tears, probably several days or maybe even several weeks or even months into, you have to be very careful how you offer that feedback. And often feedback in organizations where people don't understand how to give feedback looks something like, it's not working for me. Can you try something else? Or that doesn't really do it. Let's go back to the drawing board. That's not helpful feedback. And not only is it not helpful feedback in the moment, but it doesn't help the person on your team understand how to think in a way that will help them do better next time. Your job as a leader when you're offering feedback isn't just to get the project right. Your job as a leader when you're offering feedback is to help your team understand how to get it right next time. Not just this time, but next time, how to think more strategically and systemically about the work in a way that lines up with your philosophy of how you recognize good work. So out of the gate, when somebody brings something to you that you feel like isn't really hitting the mark, the worst thing you can do is say, this isn't working. Instead, I always challenge leaders to identify at least one thing about their thought process that you like. Oh, I like how you incorporated this theme that we talked about in a meeting a couple of weeks ago into your work. I really like that. I think that really hits the mark. Now, and after the now is usually when we say, but it's not working for me. That's not what we want to do. Instead, I always encourage people to ask about the process that led you to the result. So instead of challenging the end product and saying the product isn't working for me, which is not terribly helpful, dive into their process. Explain to me how you arrived at this thing being the thing that's not resonating. Explain to me how you got to this decision about how this turned out. Explain to me why you went there. Let them talk through their process, walk backward through the process. And then at some point you'll arrive at a fork in the road, inevitably, where you can say, oh, I see. Okay, I see how we ended up there. What if, this is the third part of it, what if instead of doing this, we tried to do this instead? So you're basically walking backward from the end product. You're allowing them to explain their process, their reasoning, so that you can identify the fork in the road where their reasoning diverged from your reasoning or the way you would have done the project. And then you ask them, what if we do this thing instead? Now, at that point, it's typical for leaders to say, oh, I see where you made a mistake. Don't do that, do this, and let me explain to you how to do it. again, that's not very helpful, because basically what you're doing is you're stepping in and doing the work for your team. What you want to do instead is say, what if we took this approach instead? How would you pursue that? If you were to take this approach instead of the one you took, how might you follow that through to the end? What might be the logical result of this path? Let them work it through. Let them solve the problem. Let them go off on their own, work the new direction, come back to you with a finished product. Do not step in and clamp down and try to control their work. When you move from executor role to manager role, right? From the maker to the manager, you have to transition from a mindset of control to a mindset of influence. It's no longer your job to do the work, it's your job to lead the work. Now, yes, you're still accountable for the team doing good work. Of course you are. But how they go about that is critically important, because if you're constantly stepping in and managing by control, you're training your team just to wait for you to tell them what to do. And your efforts will never scale as a leader. And your team is not going to be able to perform at its best if they're constantly waiting for you to tell them what to do. They're going to be paralyzed, and they're not going to bring their unique perspective, their diversity of opinion to the table. So we have to instead instill this mindset of leadership by principle. You see, leading by control is about presence. I have to be physically present constantly. Leading instead by influence is about leading by principle. I'm going to instill in you a set of principles that help you make better decisions. And so when I'm offering feedback, I'm not just telling you what's right and what's wrong in this specific instance. I'm giving you principles by which you can think about future projects. So when I'm walking you through how I think about it, walking you back to that fork in the road, I'm basically teaching you, okay, here's how I process this. Now, use these principles, go off and do the work yourself. Think about it through this lens instead, and come back to me and let me see what you do with that. When you do that, you're training your team not just to solve a situational problem, but you're teaching them timeless principles that will continue to help them solve problems moving forward. And over time, your entire team begins to bend around those principles, and you begin to notice, oh, my team is actually doing work that I don't have to offer as much feedback on, because they understand how I think about the work instead of me having to step in and control it all the time.
Wow, that's excellent. So much there to take into consideration. I think will be useful for leaders and their teams as they think about their processes for evaluating and working through and moving forward with this type of work for their institutions. One thing that struck me, Todd, was in providing feedback that, as you said, it's not about you're the executor providing all the answers, but there are a lot of questions and asking questions. And I'm sure that it's something that we need to be thoughtful and intentional about the language and how we phrase some of these questions. How can we get better at asking questions and shifting our mindset to that type of approach to giving feedback?
I think the most important thing is we have to cultivate empathy for the people on our team. And I know we hear this all the time. It sounds like a cliche. We'll just be more empathetic. It almost feels non-empathetic to tell people to be more empathetic, right? But that's really what we have to do. Before you have any meeting that's going to be a difficult conversation with a team member about a project or about something, some area where they're not performing up to snuff, it's important that you pause, that you put yourself in their position, that you recall a time in your life when you maybe didn't hit the mark, a time in your life maybe when you underperformed, when a manager had to have a difficult conversation with you, or maybe a time in your life when your manager didn't handle the situation well. And think about how it feels to be in their shoes before you enter into that conversation. Your job isn't just to get the work right. I know that is what we're there for. I know that ultimately that's the value that we produce organizationally. But your job as a leader is to develop the people on your team. I always tell people that your role as a leader is to do three things: to accomplish the work, which is where most people put a period, by the way, accomplish the work while developing your team to tackle new and more challenging work. If you're not doing all three of those things, accomplishing the work, because we have to do that, while developing your team, right? So you're building into your team, you're developing your team to accomplish new and more challenging work, meaning that their sphere of influence and their ability to tackle work is getting greater and greater over time, which means giving them more responsibility, letting them potentially fail from time to time, so that now you have to let them fail in a meaningful way and in a way that is not going to do harm to the organization. That's part of the challenge as a leader, is you can't just say, well, hey, I'm sorry that we completely bombed that last campaign, but hey, my team sure learned a lot. No, of course that's not going to work. So you have to be seeking out opportunities for people to take risks and fail in a way that doesn't completely undermine the organizational objective. But within that, I think the biggest task for the leader is to empathize, where you understand they're looking for opportunities to shine. They're looking for opportunities to please you. And so as a manager coming in and offering feedback and trying to get your team to another place, the most important thing you can do is to pause and remember what it feels like to be in that place, and then to try to meet them in a way that is consistent with how you would want to be met if you were in their shoes. That could mean speaking hard truth to them. That could mean saying, hey, you're not cutting it in this role and we're going to have to move you to a different role. Or sometimes, frankly, sometimes the most loving thing in the world is to actually let somebody go from an organization. I know that sounds really counterintuitive, but sometimes it's just not a good fit for them and they're stuck, and you can see they're stuck, and they're just never going to be able to perform at the level, but they're afraid to move on. But you have to begin with empathy. You have to begin with identifying where they are, how they're feeling, and then try to enter into the conversation with an understanding of that in mind, so that you're meeting them with what they need most from you.
And as I think through the insight that you provided and the emphasis on process and honoring that process as we get feedback, I'm sure there's someone listening saying, well, what happens when there's no time for that, or we're on a tight timeline and have an immediate deadline, or something along those lines? So when those circumstances arise, hopefully not as frequently as may seem to be the case, but is there a middle ground anywhere where we can still move things ahead quickly, but to some degree honor the process as we get feedback?
Of course. Yeah. Listen, we are create on demand professionals. That's what we are. So there are always going to be emergencies. There are going to be times when it's all hands on deck. We need to do whatever needs to be done to get the work accomplished. Of course, that's always going to be the case. But it can't be every time, all the time, every week. And unfortunately, in some organizations, it is, because there isn't a stable process supporting their ambitions. I talk about in Herding Tigers the two dynamics that leaders have to mind organizationally, the two things that creative people need from us as leaders. The first one is stability. Creative people need stability. They need to have clarity of process, clarity of expectations. They need to know that the ground underneath of them isn't going to shift because somebody had some kind of strange whim, and suddenly now the process is changing, the objectives are changing because I just wasn't bought in emotionally 2 weeks ago when we started the project. They need to know that there's going to be clarity of expectations, clarity of process, that you as a leader are securing buy-in at critical moments from the stakeholders in the organization, so that that person who is your boss's boss's boss isn't just going to come in and say, that's not working for me, let's do something different, 3 weeks from now, after we put 3 weeks into something. So there needs to be some stability of process, clarity, and we need to have clear timelines, clear expectations, all of that. Generally, okay, because there are always going to be times when we throw those things out the window because we just have to make it happen. I get that. The second thing we need is challenge. We need we want to be pushed. We need to know that our leader believes in us. Our leader sees things in us. Our leader wants us to accomplish more than we think we're capable of. So creative people, highly creative people, want to be pushed and be in an environment that's challenging to them. The problem is, Rob, that stability and challenge exist in tension with one another. So as you increase the amount of challenge organizationally, so let's say, that last minute project, we've all got to pull together, we got to make it happen. There's no time, we have few resources, and it really feels like this coming together moment for an organization, and we pull it off, and it's amazing. And that's great if it's every so often. But if every single week the manager comes in and says, all right, this is the most important week in the history of the organization. Well, you said that for the last 5 weeks or the last 6 weeks. We are exhausted. There's no process. There's no predictability here. We don't know how to channel our energy. So what happens? We begin to sort of shrink back and withhold a little bit because we don't know what's going to be expected of us next week. So we're not going to spend everything we have this week, because you might need me to do that next week. So I'm going to begin sandbagging a little bit so I have some reserves just in case. So what we have to do as a leader is we have to have some supporting structure. Your team needs to see that you're fighting for them, that you're fighting for that predictability, the clarity, the expectations, that you're getting stakeholder buy-in at critical moments, and that you're not going to let somebody come in and just completely bulldoze over your process that's been going on for 3 weeks just because they didn't really feel like engaging 3 weeks ago when you started the project, which happens very often. The single-minded CEO, or maybe the dean or somebody, in a different sphere, but will come in and will just say, nah, it's not working for me, let's do something else. And you have no choice. Well, you need to be advocating for your team and making sure that that person is intellectually engaged when you need them to be engaged, so that that doesn't happen. But if you have some stability of process and your team sees you fighting for them, then those moments when, of course we have to pull together every so often to make something happen. If those are fewer and farther between, then you will maintain your team's trust. People will feel like, okay, I know sometimes we have to do stuff that we don't want to do, or we have to spend ourselves in ways we don't want to spend ourselves, but generally speaking, I can see that this is an environment where I can thrive over the long term. So it's really about making sure that there's some predictability in the midst of the chaos, at least most of the time, so that the exceptions are times when people can rise to the occasion without feeling like they're being used and abused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way to frame that, stability and challenge, and how those come together. And it's another thing in this discussion, the thought of this being an opportunity, giving feedback to eventually bring a team together. And as you said, to have a supporting structure. And I love the thought of leading by principle rather than leading by presence. So all of this points to a process of building culture. It's much more about just giving creative feedback about creative work, but building a culture for the team, the organization that you want. So something perhaps we should all be more mindful of, whether it's specifically about giving feedback or even just a meeting, but all those individual moments of thinking and taking the time and stepping back of, how do I want this? What is the culture that I want and that we strive for together, and always be mindful of culture.
Yeah, that is one of the primary roles of a leader of any team, is to maintain the culture, to make sure that you're cultivating the things that you want and that you're pruning the things that you don't want. Sometimes, especially when we're busy, we excuse bad behavior. This is the phrase normalization of deviance is a phrase that was coined in the wake of one of the space shuttle tragedies, when they realized that there was a phenomenon called foam shedding that had been occurring on launches for quite a while, and it had never really done any damage. So it just became normalized, that some of the foam on I think it was the external tank, the fuel tank, would break off during the, sort of really violent launch. But because it had never done damage, it was just kind of an expected thing. And they even termed the phrase, termed it foam shedding. And then, of course, one fateful time, that foam that broke off actually damaged a part of the heat shield and caused a disaster upon re-entry of the space shuttle. And in the wake of that, they termed this phrase normalization of deviance, meaning when we see behavior that's deviant behavior that we don't really want, but we accept it just because, well, we're too busy doing other things to worry about it, it really erodes a culture. And I believe that's very true in team dynamics. You have that one person on your team who acts like a prima donna and just expects the world to turn around them. The sun rises and sets when they show up and leave work. And I see a lot of organizations excusing that behavior because, well, we don't want to disrupt the talent. We're too busy to have to worry about that person and have to hire in their place. And where would we ever find a person like that? But what you're doing culturally is you're subtly sending a message to the rest of the team that this person really is kind of the center of what we do here, and they can do whatever they want. As long as you're talented, you can get away with whatever you want to get away with. And that's a terrible message to send to a team. It's a terrible culture to build, because you're devaluing the contribution of everybody else in the team. And so, I would really challenge people to consider culturally, is there any way I'm normalizing deviance? It could be people showing up late to meetings. In this particular culture, we just, everybody's 5 minutes late to a meeting. That's just the way it is. Or meetings always run over by 10, 15 minutes. That's just the way it is. We don't really honor people's time. That's a great example of normalizing deviance. You're basically saying, your time really isn't as valuable as whatever the person leading the meeting wants to say. And we don't care enough about your time to try to keep things on schedule so that we can keep this this locked up. Another dynamic related to culture is something I call ghost rules. And ghost rules are these invisible narratives that can easily creep into organizations about who can and can't introduce an idea, how you do and don't get promoted organizationally, who can and can't speak to whom in the organization. Things like, and I know you've probably never heard this, Rob, but well, that'll never work around here, right? A phrase like that, with that. I've heard that so many times in organizations, but we don't challenge it as leaders. Well, that'll never work around here. Hold on, time out. Why? Why would that never work around here? Well, I don't know. I think somebody just said that once upon a time, or I heard a story about a time when somebody tried that and it didn't work. That's a ghost rule. It's an invisible narrative. And so one of our jobs as leaders too is to occasionally stop a meeting and say, hold on, somebody just said something that I'm not 100% sure is accurate. I think that's a ghost rule. I think that maybe we're living by assumption here. Maybe we need to test that assumption, because I think that this could be a good idea and we're not allowing ourselves to pursue it because of this invisible narrative. So, when it comes to our culture, we have to regularly fertilize and reward the things we want. So if you see somebody engaging in behavior that you like, say, great, wonderful. Hey, I just want to stop the meeting right now and say, way to go. That idea that you just shared, that was a risky thing for you to say. I really appreciate that you did that. If you reward things like that, even just verbally, I'm not talking about buying them a gift card to a steakhouse or something. It's, hey, I really appreciate that you brought that up. That really means a lot. I know you took a risk saying that. Thank you. And then prune the things that you don't want, just like a garden, right? You fertilize the things you want, you prune the things you don't want. And over time, your culture begins to take the shape that you want it to take. And then it just requires, it's like, again, like a garden. If you plant a garden well and you take care of it early on, then it's just a matter of maintenance, right? It's just regular fertilizing and pruning, and the garden will grow on its own.
That's great. Excellent. Again, I think we could have a whole episode just getting into culture and all the things that we could do, especially in our sector and higher ed, to be constantly cultivating culture in our organizations. Also want to spend a few minutes talking about, as we address giving feedback, but also getting feedback and thinking about, again, our sector and our creative teams that work across college or university. And that work certainly includes partnering with our faculty colleagues and academic administrators and others who may not be overly familiar with the creative process, or even, as mentioned before, a committee of stakeholders. So thinking about, as you said, advocating for your teams. And I think a lot of times there are myths about the process and sometimes certainly myths about creatives themselves. So what are some of those myths about creative people? How would you describe those? And specifically, ways that we can overcome them and advocate for our teams and educate our colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, one of them is that creative people are not strategic thinkers, right? That's one of the myths that drives me crazy the most, because people think that simply because their thought process is a little different, or maybe it takes them a little longer to get to the point in a meeting, that they're not thinking as strategically as everyone else, or that they don't have a business mind or an organizational mind. And it's simply not true. It's just the creative process or the thought process for a highly creative person. We're all creative. We all solve problems, but there's some people who just think differently. They have a different mode of thinking. So they think more systemically. They're more easily able to get outside into the adjacent possible, as Stephen Johnson calls it, and to combine ideas and to play with ideas and all of the potential second and third order consequences of those ideas. And they sometimes get lost in that thought. And so because of that, a lot of people confuse that with a messy, unorganized thought process. It's not. It's just a different kind of circular thought process. And so that's one of the myths that drives me crazy. And so we have to recognize that maybe everybody at the table isn't going to be as efficient as we want them to be, but they're just as valuable, just as effective, even though they have a different kind of thought process. A second myth that drives me crazy is that creative people just want complete freedom. Don't fence me in, give me complete freedom. And while this is often expressed by highly creative people, I want freedom, stop telling me what to do. It's often the result of overly constrictive boundaries. It's their reaction against an unhealthy organizational dynamic that's causing them to say that. It's not necessarily that they want complete freedom. Complete freedom is not useful for a creative pro. If you just say, okay, marketing campaign, go, right? Without any kind of guide rails or boundaries. No, it's silly. It's not going to work. They need boundaries, but what they want are boundaries that allow them some room to play, to experiment, to try new things. And so really what we're aiming for when we're leading creatives is bounded autonomy. We want freedom within boundaries. We want clear and healthy boundaries that set the guide rails, let them know where to focus their energy, because without those, they're not going to be effective. But within that, we need to allow some freedom to play with ideas, to experiment. And by the way, that means building time into the process. That means maybe recognizing things aren't always going to be as efficient as we want them to be. You can't treat creativity like a machine. Equal input, equal output. It doesn't work that way. And so that I would say that's probably a second myth that drives me crazy, is this creative just want complete freedom. Creative people are egomaniacs, or they're completely insecure. That's another one that I hear pretty often. And again, a lot of times these are the outward representations that people project. Maybe they come across as egocentric or really insecure. But again, sometimes because they're not being fed properly, they don't feel like they have a safe place. Sometimes what comes across as being an egomaniac is actually a deep-seated insecurity. I'm not certain that I'm bringing the value I want to bring, or that is expected of me. And so I feel like I have to position myself as the kind of person who is aggressive and absolutely certain of myself, so that I can protect myself from the feedback that's inevitably going to come my way. So if I intimidate everybody else, then maybe they won't come in and intimidate me. And so we have to be really careful as leaders not to fall prey to these myths, and recognize that a lot of these stereotypes about highly creative people are the result of poor leadership in their past. If we lead them properly, we can get into a much more healthy, productive place.
Yeah, so many points here resonate, and especially continue to think about culture and building that culture. And you mentioned giving the team the ability to take risks and try new things. And again, I'm thinking of that within a higher education environment. And we talked about the committee-driven and sometimes consensus-driven nature of academia. And so thinking along those lines, because you write that highly creative people live in an ethos of different. And that's always an interesting topic in higher ed when we talk about differentiation, because that can be hard. And higher ed marketing is sometimes criticized for its lack of differentiation, and that it's just a sea of sameness. And there's so many factors that play into that. Our institutions do so many different things for so many different constituencies, but sometimes, again, that general feeling of being afraid to be bold and put ourselves out there as an institution or a stake in the ground in a certain area. And again, that committee-driven approach can often be one of those things that chips away at that. So just thinking about any other strategies or ways to continue to build that environment where your team or teams feel like, wow, it's okay to take creative risks. I have an opportunity to do something new or different, or do my very best work.
Yeah, I think one additional thing I would throw on the pile of things we've talked about so far is celebrate the process, not just the product. In the same way that when you're giving feedback, you don't want to obsess about the end product, because the end product is a result of a process, and the process is really what you want to dive into, because that's what's going to help them do better work in the future. And in the same way, we need to celebrate process and not just end product. So it's easy at the end of a product to say, hey, great campaign, everybody. That was amazing. Good job. Let's talk about the results. But when you see somebody doing something that you think is worthy of celebration, pause and celebrate that person. Maybe throw a party in the middle of a project, not at the end of a project, right? Like, hey, we're taking a big risk here. Hey, that was, we didn't go with that idea, but that was an amazing idea. And I really think there's something there for the future. And I want to celebrate that we even thought about pursuing. 5 years ago, we never would have thought about pursuing that. And now that's actually within our sort of menu of options, that we might have actually gone with that. That's incredible. So take the time to celebrate in the midst of the process, not just at the end of the process. Now, of course, we need to pause and celebrate at the end of a process too. Sometimes we do the work, we finish the work, we launch the work, and then boom, we're on to the next thing. We never stop to celebrate and to say, hey, let's talk about what we learned through this process. Let's look backward. Let's look at some patterns. Let's talk about what went really well. And then let's talk about what didn't go so well. How can we improve moving forward? So I think just those couple of things, just, making sure that you're celebrating not just product, but process related things, I think will help significantly in pushing your team to take more risks and try new things. And it'll reinforce the culture that you want as well. And then make sure that you have checkpoints built into your process so that at certain moments you're stopping and doing a pulse check and you're saying, hey, all right, let's celebrate. Let's talk about what happened. Let's talk about what didn't go so well. And let's figure out what we can learn moving forward so that we do better next time. I think those are really critical parts of the process. If we want to, again, if we're just doing one project, big deal. Do whatever you want, burn through people, whatever, because they're going to move on to something else anyway. But if your goal is to build a culture where you're continuing to do better work over time and you're developing people, you're not going through this cycle of having to, hire new people every year and a half because they're burning out, which, let's just talk about the cost of that, right? Of having to cycle through turnover is just so unbelievably destructive to an organization, not just in terms of morale, but in terms of financial resources. Like, it's crazy expensive to have to keep training new people and bringing them up to speed. And so, if your goal is to be in this for the long haul, then you need to think about process, not just product.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I'm sure there are a lot of other things that we could dive into and unpack. But I do want to ask is if there are any other key points, any other major things that we haven't covered that we should be sure to address for higher ed marketers as they lead their creative teams, try to help their teams flourish and help their teams unlock their creative potential. Anything else that we should cover?
Well, I do think, I kind of close the book with this, this idea that, listen, you're going to do great work. You're going to do work and the work is going to be known. But let's face it, like 100 years from now, nobody's going to remember that marketing campaign you just worked on. 100 years from now, your institution may not even be around anymore. In 100 years. Now, Indiana University's been around for a while. I know for you, Rob, and I know for a lot of them, a lot of institutions, they've been around for quite a while. But I always tell businesses, listen, your business probably will not be around in 100 years. However, the impact that you make on the lives of the people you lead will continue to resound for generations to come. Because as you lead that person properly, they're going to turn around and lead the person that they're accountable for leading, when they get promoted, and then that's going to happen again. It's going to happen again. And so your influence can ripple through the culture over the course of decades, lifetimes, generations. And so I challenge all of you to think about that. What kind of echoes are you making as a leader? Are you making echoes that are going to be positive echoes? Would you be proud of how the person under the person, under the person, under the person that's being led by the person you're leading now, in 40 years or whatever? Are you going to be proud of how your influence is still present in that person's life? So my encouragement is just be a person who makes the kind of echoes that you want to see in the world as a leader.
Terrific. Thank you for that thought. A powerful charge for those who are leading teams in higher ed or anywhere. So appreciate that. And also, Todd, for anyone who wants to learn more about you, the work that you're doing, where should they go to get more resources, information about your work?
So accidentalcreative.com is my company website. And we have two podcasts, the Accidental Creative Podcast, and I have a daily show called The Daily Creative. So I encourage you to check both of those out. And pretty much anything else you want, you can find at accidentalcreative.com.
And I don't know if there's time with all the podcasts and everything else you're doing, but any new exciting projects in the works, perhaps a new book or anything along those lines?
I am working on some things. I'm working on a couple of projects right now. I have, of course, I can't just work on one book. So I actually have 3 books right now that I'm working on. One of them will probably take the lead at some point and become the next project. But I'm kind of working working on a couple of things. One of them is about motivation, and working with a couple of other people, actually researchers who have been studying motivation for several years, and working on pulling together a book about what is it that truly motivates people. And it's a very different perspective than what has traditionally been written about. So I'm very excited about that. And then I have a couple other projects I'm working on as well, book projects that I'm not really ready to talk about yet, but I'm working on them, kind of, tinkering in the garage, if you will, and hopefully getting them ready for the world soon. So,
yeah. Well, good luck with those. And Todd, thanks so much for sharing your time, your expertise. This has been great.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob.
Thank you again to Todd Henry at The Accidental Creative. Thank you also to M. Stoner, which produces Higher Ed Live and makes these episodes possible. I'm Rob Zinkin. Thanks again for tuning in to Marketing Live on the Higher Ed Live Network.